A reading from the Gospel of John. Passing through Samaria, Jesus and the disciples arrived at noon at Jacob's well, near a Samaritan village. Being weary, Jesus sat down by the well while the disciples entered town to buy food. A Samaritan woman came for water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." The woman said, "You, a Jew, are asking a drink of me, a Samaritan and a woman at that?" Jews and Samaritans never shared the same utensils. Jesus said, "If you knew what God has to give, you would be asking for living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have no jar, and the well is deep. How can you offer me living water?" Jesus replied, "Those who drink this water will soon again thirst, but not so of the living water of which I speak. For it will be an inner spring welling up eternally." "Then give me this living water," the woman said. "Go home and bring back your husband," Jesus said. "I have no husband," she answered. "True," said Jesus, "for though you've had 5 husbands, the man you live with now is not your husband." "I can see that you are a prophet," the woman answered. At that moment the disciples returned and were shocked to find Jesus talking with this woman. But the woman put down her jar and ran into the town, where she said to the people, "Come and meet this man who has told me everything about myself." The townspeople did come out and make their way to him. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
A water jar. A water jar left at Jacob's well in the noonday sun. A water jar. That's about all you'd see if you went to draw water that afternoon at the well. Quite surprising, really, that such an essential thing as someone's water jar would be left behind, would be misplaced, would be forgotten. For the well in ancient times was a precious place, and this jar, a necessary item, especially in dry and barren Samaria. So early in the morning, before the sun bore down its scorching heat, the women of the village would gather at the well to draw their day's supply. In fact, one might say that the village, for the village, this well was the very center of their lives. For there, not only did they draw their essentials for the day, the essentials for cleansing and cooking and quenching their thirst, but in a real sense, at this well, they also drew life itself from one another as they joined in lively conversation, as they greeted one another, and they shared in a supportive community at the start of each and every day. And this forgotten water jar. Well, according to John's gospel, it was a jar brought by a woman who drew water at noon that day. Why wasn't she with the other women? Why? Well, maybe she ran out of water midday. Maybe she had other issues to attend to that morning, or maybe, just maybe, she was more comfortable alone. Maybe shame or sadness or a history of hardship made those morning gatherings with the other women at the well, it made them just too painful as these other women talked about their successful children, their happy husbands, their perfect lives. Because, of course, hers has not gone that way. And yet it's from her water jar that Jesus asked for a drink. From her water jar. He actually talked to her. That's what the hearers of this story in Jesus' day would have said when they heard this little tiny tidbit. He shouldn't talk to her, for a Jewish man never initiates conversation with an unknown woman. And what's more, a Jewish teacher like Jesus would never engage in public conversation with one at all. In fact, part of the morning prayer for the men in Judaism was the line which read, "Thank God I am not a woman." Why, holy men did not even speak to their own wives in public. In fact, one group of men who were religious leaders of that day were known as the bruised and bleeding Pharisees. Do you know why? Because when they saw a woman coming down the street, they closed their eyes, even if it meant walking into a wall and breaking their noses. Yet Jesus spoke to this woman. He spoke to her. And then to make matters worse, she was not just a woman. She was a Samaritan woman. A Samaritan, the unclean people. They didn't worship God in the right place. They didn't perform the proper religious rituals, and worse yet, they'd intermarried with non-Jews. But Jesus knows this, of course. And as his insightful conversation with her reveals, he even knows more about her than she herself would even care to admit. And Jesus asked her for a drink of water from her jar, willfully exposing himself to what many believed was contamination. Contaminated. That must be how she felt. This Samaritan woman, I mean. Coming to the well in the noonday sun alone, surely the water she draws in this water jar is all the life she really has, and yet we are told that she leaves it behind, that she forgets to take it with her. Why? Well, maybe something happens. Maybe something happens in her conversation with Jesus. And what this jar has to offer is nothing compared to what Jesus has to give. "May I have a drink of your water?" Jesus says. She's shocked, and she responds, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" It is, of course, because Jesus knows. Jesus knows he's not the only one who suffers from thirst at that well this noon. For before him is a woman, a Samaritan woman, marginalized, exploited, oppressed, considered contaminated by a culture more concerned with purity law than with people. But Jesus will have none of this. Because he knows she is desperately thirsty herself, that she thirsts for life, a life that her culture has denied her, a life, as Bill Davison says, that she had to literally struggle and scrape out of a culture that is mercilessly unyielding in its giving of value and purpose and self-esteem. Yes, Jesus knows she struggles to draw life for herself, much as she struggles to draw water alone in the noontime sun with this water jar. So Jesus speaks, and Jesus says, "I know you. I know who you are, a woman. You are a Samaritan woman, and I know you very well indeed. Now let me tell you who I am. And let me tell you who you are," Jesus says. "I am the Messiah, and you, my daughter, you are a precious, valuable, treasured, prized, cherished, and loved child of God." Leslie Weatherhead, a theologian and a minister. During World War II, during the London Blitz, he was also served as an air raid warden. meaning that after a bombing raid, when all the clear was sounded, it was his job to go out into the city and to survey the damage. Well, one night after a particular raid in his surveillance, he heard the sound of a crying child. So he walked around some ruins, and to his amazement, he found a little 8-year-old boy on the rubble that had once been a building. Weatherhead went up to the child and he said, "Where do you live, son? Where's your home?" And the little boy pointed up the street where there was now nothing. "Where are your parents?" Weatherhead asked. "My father's in the Navy," the little boy said, "and my mother was killed 2 nights ago." At that point, Weatherhead got down to his knees to look straight in the little boy's eyes, and he asked, tell me, son, who are you?" And with that, the little boy began to cry harder and harder and harder until through his tears, he finally said, "Mister, I ain't nobody. Mister, I ain't nobody's nothing." Leslie Weatherhead commented later. He commented that he would never forget that night. Never forget that little boy's overwhelming pain of feeling unconnected and unimportant to anybody else in the world. And you know, when Jesus meets this Samaritan woman at the well, I think just as Weatherhead spotted it in that little lost Londoner, Jesus is able to spot the pain and the misery as clearly in her life. Yes, he brings up her past, but he does so not to shame her. He does so to demonstrate just how little that history affects the way Jesus and God will receive her. That she is lovely, she is clean in God's eyes, she is shiny and new. Now, I don't know about you. I sometimes struggle with that concept from time to time, which is probably why I say it to you every Sunday in the benediction. I need to remind myself as well. You see, sometimes I find myself struggling and troubled. I'm sometimes troubled by the things I did or things I said in my past. And even though I've asked God to forgive me for them, and even though I've asked those who I might have injured or harmed to forgive me, when those memories return, they still haunt me, and they still chip away. They still chip away at what I know is God's promise to me that I just can't seem to get through this block of a head that sits on my shoulders. And when it happens, I always try to remember the story Casey told me one time at a very difficult moment in my life. Seems a number of years ago, rumors were spreading far and wide about a certain Catholic woman. This Catholic woman was having visions of Jesus. And she was saying that Jesus was coming and talking with her. It was said Jesus appeared to her on a regular basis, and he even spoke to her about significant matters of faith. Well, when word of this came to the archbishop of the region, he was determined to squelch such superstitious nonsense by posing a test for the woman and her supposed visions, sure. So the archbishop went to the woman one day and he said haughtily, "I understand, madam." I don't know that's how a bishop talks, but I'm going to try. "I understand, madam, that you claim to talk to Jesus. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's true," the woman said. "Well then," still the bishop, got it? "Well then," the archbishop replied, "the next time you have a vision, I want you to ask Jesus to tell you the sins I confessed in my last confessional. And when he enumerates for you my many sins, please call me and let me know what Jesus has to say." Well, convinced that he had unmasked the falsity of this woman's claims, the haughty archbishop went back to his domicile with a self-satisfied air. 10 days later, the woman notified her spiritual leader of her recent apparition of Jesus and asked her spiritual leader to convey that message to the archbishop that he'd asked her to do. And within an hour, the archbishop was back at the woman's house. Harshly, he asked her, "So you asked Jesus about my sins, did you?" "Oh, yes, I did," the woman said. "And what did Jesus say?" the archbishop asked. "Well," said the woman, "when I asked Jesus about your sins, Jesus said to tell you he can't remember." Wow. What a thought, huh? Think about that for a moment. Your sins, my transgressions, your omissions, my bad choices, all forgotten, because what God longs to give is so much more important than what by our failings have been taken away. I like how Frank Howe says it. I meet a lot of people who could rightly be called church-damaged people, who have had some of their most painful experiences of shame and humiliation in churches, often in God's name. And I've met a lot of Christians whose ability to function as evangelists, as ministers, as people who proclaim good news so that others can experience it, is seriously impaired by their concern to make sure that sinners know just how shameful their behavior is and that they be kept from the center of Christian community. But for me, Howe says, the question about how we evangelize isn't a question of what would Jesus do? It's the question of what did Jesus do? And what did he do? He received this Samaritan woman who had shyly ventured to the well at noon. He received her with such grace and compassion that she was profoundly transformed, allowing the living water he offered to change her life forever. I know you've heard this humorous story. I'll tell it again because it fits right here. Father sent his son to bed. 5 minutes later, the little boy screams, "Dad, can you get me a glass of water?" Father calls back, "No, son, you had your chance, go to sleep." 5 minutes later, the boy screams again, "Dad, can you get me a glass of water?" Again, the father screams back, "No, son, you had your chance. I said, go to sleep." A few minutes later, it came again, "Dad, can you get me a glass of water?" "Jimmy," the father said, "I'm tired of this. I told you, you had your chance. If you ask me one more time, I'm going to come up there and I'm going to spank you." There was a short pause. And then the voice of the little boy called down once again, saying, "Dad, when you come up here to spank me, can you bring me a glass of water?" That's it, folks. That's it. An incredibly beautiful story, I think, and that it demonstrates the simple trust of a little boy for his father, the trust that his failings, they would not be remembered, and the provision of all he needed would certainly still be expected, for surely the father would bring the water this little boy so desperately desired. Now look, I'm no psychic, so I have no way of knowing what you're thirsty for today. I know some of you are still struggling with deep grief, and you need that to be quenched. I know some of you are still struggling with an illness or a major disappointment, and you need some relief from that. I know others of you are just thirsting to break out of a malaise where life seems to have lost a bit of buoyancy and hope. Or maybe you just arrived here empty today. You're just looking to fill yourself up, if for nothing more than one more week. So let me ask you, what do you think are the obstacles that stand in the way of you getting your spiritual thirst quenched today? What are they? What are the obstacles that stand in the way of you not only getting the drinking water you need, but getting your deepest thirst satisfied, your spiritual thirst, your thirst to know God? Well, the water jar that this woman brought to the well, the gospel tells us, was left behind at Jesus' feet. For Jesus had shown her the source of living water that bubbled up within her eternally. And this woman just didn't need that water jar any longer, because it was only for toting around something much less valuable, much less necessary, and much less desirable. So how about you? How about me? How about those of us who call ourselves Christians? We, the people who have been touched by Christ and the grace of God. Are we still toting around empty jars? I mean, are we still looking to fill ourselves with these temporary fixes? If so, then perhaps we need to remember that as Christians, we can always tap the inexhaustible source of this living water. It's a grace from God that flows endlessly. It doesn't make us perfect, folks. It doesn't make us perfect, but it does make us beloved children of God. I like how Maya Angelou put it. When I say I'm a Christian, I'm not shouting I'm clean living. I'm whispering I'm lost, I'm found, and forgiven. When I say I'm a Christian, I'm not trying to be strong. I'm professing that I'm weak and I need some strength to carry on. When I say I'm a Christian, I'm not bragging of success. I'm admitting that I've failed and need God to clean up my mess. When I say I'm a Christian, I'm not claiming to be perfect, for my flaws are far too visible. But God believes I'm worth it. When I say I'm a Christian, I'm not saying I'm holier than thou. I'm just saying I'm a simple sinner who received God's good grace somehow. It's a beautiful story, really. The Samaritan woman leaves her water jar behind. And I wonder, maybe today, we need to be considering what we should be leaving behind too. Those things that represent hungers and thirst that no longer need satisfaction. Because quite frankly, as followers of Christ, we do have everything we need. All a gift from our God, so that we may never be thirsty again. And that is a truth, my friends, that you can safely believe. Amen.